Welcome to Podcast Principles. My name is Ryan R. Sullivan, founder of Podcast Principles, and on this podcast, we'll be diving into the podcast principles, the guidelines that we've accumulated over the last 4 years of creating and launching podcasts. Over those last 4 years, I've edited over 500 episodes, been a part of over 15 podcasts, and interviewed 200 people. Over that, we have developed these guidelines, these principles for creating and launching your podcast. To take it back a little bit, it all started in my parents' garage, and going from that to now being able to work with personal brands all around the globe, from athletes to mentalists to entrepreneurs. When it comes to podcasting for personal brands, there are no solutions out there. There are thousands of resources that are all created just for SEO, so you'll click on them off of Google, but there's no actual solutions made by people who are creating and launching podcasts. So that is what we are doing here with Podcast Principles. That is why we have created this podcast specifically to cut out any of the fluff and to only include what you can actually apply to your own podcast to launch, generate your audience, build your personal brand. Podcasting is powerful. It's changed my life, but the honest truth is that you can waste a lot of time if you're doing it incorrectly. But this is what content marketing is evolving into. Content is the new advertising. YouTube is the number 2 search engine in the world. Audio and video content are growing exponentially every single day. But if you're on LinkedIn, if you're on Facebook, on these social media platforms, you're seeing this. But what does this mean for personal brands? Well, as a personal brand, similar to what a lot of companies are doing, you're actually creating your own media company because you have to connect with audiences in a thought-provoking way, something that actually connects with them, right? So that means delivering value is your new form of advertising. Most people are not ready to buy from you. The 99% of people are just consuming your content every day. So you have to be there. You have to be the one to give them that value. So when they need the solution that you provide, you're the one that they go to. And how do you do that? Creating organic content through podcasting. Like, the reason that you would create a podcast and do this over anything else is because you can use a podcast to create 1,000 different forms of content. So it's not, now you don't have to sit down and actually create 10 separate videos or 10 separate posts. You literally have an hour-long podcast that becomes your audio. Then that creates 16 video clips, and then that creates 25 blog posts. Why would you ever do it the other way? Just plan it once for the podcast, and then you build the podcast around repurposing that content, and you do it all at one time instead of do it all separately. When we look back at the last couple of years, podcasting was already growing, it was already happening. But when we look at the pandemic specifically, what it did was it basically forced people to consume content online. The people who went online during this time stayed online. So that means they got used to consuming digital content. They got used to listening to podcasts when they were sitting at home. And now that things are opening up and people are driving to work and driving to the gym, they are still listening to those same podcasts. So the time is now, but you need to make sure you do it correctly. For this first season of Podcast Principles, we're going to be covering the most commonly asked questions, problems, and obstacles that podcasters face. Should I launch a podcast? How to use podcasting to simplify your content creation and make it way easier to create content online for your personal brand. How much does it cost to make a podcast and launch a podcast? Can I make money from podcasts? How do I monetize my podcast? How to use guesting and solo and other forms of interviews, as well as different forms of podcast creation, and what is the best one for you? How to grow your audience through a podcast and through content. And finally, the best way to get introduced to the medium of podcasting without all the pressure of starting one. How to be a great guest, but also how to use guesting for your advantage, how to use guesting to create and generate your own audience from other people's audiences. So that's just a taste, a feel for this first season of Podcast Principles. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode 0 of Podcast Principles. We're excited to dive into everything podcasting so you don't have to waste any time creating and launching your podcast for your personal brand. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Podcast Principles. My name is Ryan R. Sullivan, founder of Podcast Principles. You can find us everywhere on social media. So that's Podcast Principles on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram as well. When it comes to the podcast platforms, we're on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and all the other platforms. We're going to have a link in the description so you can subscribe, so you can catch every single episode when it goes out. So thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you on episode 1. Right when my mic fell. Look at that.